So, where should you be in terms of utilitarianism? And John Stuart Mill. Um, Remember what he is doing or what he says that he's looking for in the beginning of this book, and that is criterion of right and wrong. Remember, a criterion is a standard or a reference. So, it would provide a basis for making a moral judgment. The criterion would be what is it about an act that gives it its moral quality, its moral value. And he thinks that he's found this. He thinks that this exists. There is such a criterion. And he calls it his principle of utility, or the greatest happiness principle. Same thing. Right? And here is the criterion. Actions are good actions are good insofar as they promote happiness, bad insofar as they promote the reverse of happiness, which is, basically unhappiness. And then he goes on and says, might be a little bit off there, but basically by happiness is meant pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain. So, we can say an action can be judged morally by its consequences, by its results. What are the outcomes of the action? And the outcomes, or the results, or the consequences that matter are the ones that, in some way or another, affect human welfare. And welfare is just happiness or unhappiness. So we ask of anything that anybody's done, did it result overall in happiness, or did it result overall in unhappiness? Things that produce happiness are good, and things that produce unhappiness are bad. Now, of course, to use this in a way as a guide to action, we have to turn it into an imperative. As it stands, this here, the greatest happiness principle, is a definition of right and wrong, but it is not an imperative. And that's important to keep in mind because he'll kind of refer to it as if it were an imperative. We can say that the imperative is do that which will result in the greatest overall pleasure and happiness and the least amount of pain and unhappiness. Of course, the first thing that Mill addresses is his hedonism. Why is he a hedonist? Well, he's said that pleasure is the good. Pleasure is that which is to be aimed at in every action. And that's what hedonism is. Hedonism is the Greek word for pleasure, hedone. And the idea is that pleasure is the point, the purpose of life is to maximize our pleasures. Remember that he anticipates the criticism that to say that pleasure is the greatest good is to degrade human nature, let's say. That is to say that we are no better than pigs. And he has a very definite response to this criticism, and that is, you don't understand me, basically. I'm talking about the human pleasures, the ones that a human being is capable of. And those pleasures that he says the human being is capable of are what he calls the higher pleasures. Pleasures of the intellect, of feeling, and imagination. And you can fill it in however you want. That is the idea that some pleasures, which are connected up with our specifically human nature, our rational nature, have to be included in our notion of hedonism. It's not just the physical pleasures. It's not just the pleasures of sensation and things like food, drink, and sex and things like that. But the higher pleasures of thinking, using the intellect, engaging in complex, creative activities, things like that. And moreover, these so-called higher pleasures are, in fact, this is quite a claim, but the idea is that the higher pleasures are intrinsically more pleasurable than the lower pleasures. They're more satisfying than the lower pleasures. And his proof of that is just preference. That is, people who have experienced both, both the higher pleasures and lower pleasures, will tell you say intrinsically satisfying, though they find them more satisfying. No, this is a claim, an empirical claim. You can ask yourself whether you think it's true. But it's a fairly long conversation, I think. But this is what he says. You'll remember that the second objection to his hedonism, his principle, grace happiness principle, is the idea that it's selfish. Now, what he's saying is and he thinks, again, people who say this just aren't listening and don't understand it. Because he says, so far from being a selfish philosophy, the philosophy based on the greatest happiness principle is actually quite demanding. Because the greatest happiness principle is the greatest happiness principle. Looked at as an imperative, it's not my own happiness that I am seeking to maximize, but the overall happiness, the happiness of everyone who is affected. So the reason that he says demanding is because I have to be willing to make myself unhappy in certain situations if that is what is required to maximize the overall happiness. I mean, we can think of any number of examples where that's true, where in order to make sure that my action results in the greatest overall happiness, I may have to put up with a reduction in my own happiness. So there we are. At least this takes us through the first couple chapters, what he's really concerned with here. That he has given us a moral philosophy which is consequentialist, that is, the moral value of an act depends upon its consequences. The consequences that matter are the effects on human happiness. And the idea is that whatever we do, we want to maximize the overall level of happiness as possible in our actions. And his defense of his hedonism, his definition of happiness as pleasure, and his insistence that utilitarianism is not a selfish philosophy. Indeed, it is an unselfish philosophy because you can't count your own welfare as meaning more than anyone else's.